That's recording and that one's good as well, Ernie? All right. Yeah. So, we're the Open Source Club. First of all, before I get started, oh yeah. Oh, thank you. Oh my God. 2 times. Before we get started, I do want to give a quick shout out and thanks to ACM-W for letting us host during their usual meeting times, for helping us out in organizing the location, all that stuff. We're really excited about this collab. This is, as we said, oh, hold on a second. I gotta start off another little guy here. An introduction to open source and why we think it's important. We are the Open Source Club, is what we talk about during our general meetings, and we do think that it's really important that we start taking a moment now in our increasingly digital world to...
Mike.
Oh, do we have the batteries?
Yes, it should be on the podium.
Yeah, they are. Thank you.
Oh, no.
I know I might not use it though, because I feel like if I, with my loud ass voice, start using the mic, I'm going to blow out everyone's eardrums, but it would be a good idea to have like this. You might have to help me out with this mic. Low key.
I have no idea.
Oh, word? Wait.
You figure it out. It's gonna take a good time.
And then I turn it on?
I just have to switch.
Yes. Warning, that mic doesn't turn off.
Yes, that's why we have the batteries out.
That's why we...
That's actually why, yeah.
Oh, smart.
Don't scrape your computer.
We got it though, we got it.
Okay, gang.
Hello.
Okay.
Oh.
Yeah, so thank you so much to ACM-W for helping us out with that, and thank you all for pulling up. We think this is going to be a good one, and we think that we have a lot of cool things to talk about. Now, before we get into our spiel, I think it would be beneficial that we actually sort of introduce ourselves for a moment, because otherwise it's just going to be like 4 strangers yapping at you for a little while. So let's just go ahead and run through the docket.
So, hello. My name's Pablo.
The love in this room is palpable and everyone's name.
So I'm a history and political science major at Tokyo, and I got into open source about a year ago because I really like customization and privacy, and both those are 2 things which open source really does well in.
All right, I'm Lance. I'm a 3rd-year ECE student, and I do the software development subcategory of this club.
Yeah. Yep. They didn't even let you introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Lizzie. I'm the vice president. Yay! I'm a 3rd-year CSE major.
And my name is Marcial.
Yeah.
Thank you. I am the president of the Open Source Club. I'm a 3rd-year computer and information science student, and I got into open source a couple of years back when I was at the University of Toronto. Been in that community for a couple of years now, and it's gotten to the point now where my passion for it has grown to the extent that I was as lucky to get the position that I'm in today, and I'm in the position now to talk to you all about the stuff that I've been able to discover, and I'm really excited about that. So, sort of to go through what's going to be on this presentation, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to sort of give a definition for open source. I think that a lot of people, maybe even in this room, see these 2 words and have a vague idea of maybe what it is, or maybe it's totally new. And it is a good idea to sort of stop and say, what do we mean when we say these 2 words? Removing the jargon, making it a little more accessible. We're going to talk a little bit about how open source has made technology more accessible, both in the realm of being a technologist like a lot of us in this room are, in development work and in coding, and for the non-technical aspects that open source provides for becoming more accessible and making digital things have a lower barrier to entry. Then we're going to get into the concrete applications of open source. First, Lance is going to talk about how you can apply open source, the framework and the tooling that surrounds it, into your development work to improve your skills in development, better your portfolio, and sharpen your skills. Robert's going to talk a little bit about how open source can then become integrated a little bit into your personal life, applying open source frameworks and the paradigm to how you interface with technology personally. And then Lizzie is going to talk about how the open source paradigm can apply to things even beyond your immediate experience of digital tech, how it relates to your communities, how it relates to the other causes that you care about, and how it might be able to strengthen the solidarity that you experience in those areas of your life. After that, we'll give a quick little summary and a short Q&A if there were any burning, lingering questions that we have. So if I ever say something or one of us says something and you're like, ooh, that's something that I might want to follow up on, this is the perfect time to sort of bring that up to us. And at the very, very end, we're going to have an open source themed trivia game, and there is a t-shirt prize at the end. These have not been ordered yet, because since they're t-shirts, we want to make sure that whoever wins is able to get something that's comfortable for them. They are themed with different open source organizations. We picked 3, and a small percent of the proceeds that go into purchasing the shirts go directly to the nonprofit foundations for which the third is themed. So it is going a little bit to a good cause. So before we get into our spiel about open source, I wanted to take a moment and ask if anyone here knew anything about open source. Does anyone, any brave soul, want to raise their hand and say maybe a little idea of what they've heard about open source, or maybe an experience that they've had with it, if you've had a little bit of maybe experience there? Okay, I'm seeing hesitance, but that's all right, because it is definitely something that, if you're not experienced with it yet, can be a little bit jarring. There can be a little bit of a separation, right? The primary thing that we hope to sort of get to during this entire presentation is just offer this idea that open source is a crucial part of having a meaningful relationship with the technology that you use. I understand that that is very wishy-washy. That's not a definition, but it's the idea that I want you to have, especially in the back of your mind as we go through this. And the reason that I'm starting with something a little more general is because the idea of defining open source sort of started with a movement. It's not necessarily technical of a movement, it's a tech-adjacent one, but it's about how we interface with the digital world around us. And a lot of organizations in the past have made it their mission to sort of define what the rules are, how to know whether your technology that you're developing is giving users the freedoms and the sovereignty that they deserve. And so, because there's a lot of similar definitions, what we're going to do is we're going to distill a lot of the overlap and come up with a simple, practical, valid definition that will work for our purposes. So when we talk about open source, when we mean that work is open source, that means that anyone has the freedom to view, to modify, to redistribute, and to contribute to the original source of a work that powers it. So for example, in the case of software, that means that if you have an application that you use, the code that runs that application is completely visible. Not only is it visible, but you have the right to take it, to modify it, to add your own little change, and send it off into the world again. It's not like, for example, if you have a Blu-ray, for example, or some movie, and you can only make one private copy. It's the opposite, in fact. You can copy it, change it, and send it around, and make it so that the benefits that you provide perpetuate through the community. And whenever something doesn't fulfill on these freedoms, that's when we use the word proprietary. So if you top conversations with us talking about open source, you'll hear us say the word proprietary software a lot. And that's things like Instagram, like Windows, like applications that are sold to you and that you're not allowed to peek under the veil for. You just have to kind of take it as it comes, and if you're unsatisfied with the way it works, hope that somebody else fixes it, because you're not going to get the ability to do so. And now, the key word and the thing that perpetuates every aspect of that definition is, at the end of the day, freedom. And the reason we say that is because we are of the opinion that the paradigm of technology that we have right now in the world doesn't fulfill that. For one, it's really old. The most common complaint, and according to a 2024 Stack Overflow survey among professional industry technical developers, is technical debt. There's so much cruft that you have to just stick to and work off of and work around to do the work that you need to do, and that isn't a very freeing experience for us as technologists. Secondly, it's not healthy. So many people in the tech world are so stressed with the work that they have, and not in a productive way. Not in a, I'm stressed because there's work that I need to do and I'm excited to do it. It's, oh my god, I have another 50-hour week because it's crunch time and we have to get this to market. And that's not the kind of environment that produces good, meaningful work. And even away from the development side, it's just unfulfilling from the user side. It feels like every other week we're constantly bombarded with some new feature or some price up hike or some other subscription that we have to deal with just to exist around technology today. It's constantly getting more and more difficult to just enjoy technology for what it can do for us without having to constantly jump over so many hurdles, be they financial or be they in just senses that it invades our privacy or that it fills us with ads that we don't really care for, or algorithms that show us content that we don't really care either. And what we think is that all of this combines to create a paradigm and an experience and relationship with tech that is becoming suffocating and has proved itself unsustainable. And we owe it to ourselves to consider an alternative solution. So we said those 4 things, right? We said view, modify, redistribute, and contribute. Why are these things important? When we talk about the freedom to view the source for some project, for some work, the first reason that that's really important at a sort of individual level is because the most potent vehicle for learning, especially when you're a blossoming developer, is inspiration. I don't know if we have like artists in the room, but one of the big things that a lot of, okay, so yeah, we got one at least. One of the big things in art when you're trying to develop your skill and your style is tracing. It's copying the masters. It's seeing what's been done before you and using it as a foundation upon which to build your own skill. And when it comes to development, it's much the same thing. If you have a project that's doing something really well, and you have the ability to look into its code base, to look at how it runs, that's going to give you the tools to understand how you can design your own projects to have a similar level of positive experience, of good organization, something that's going to give your project longevity, right? And what, especially at not just the individual level, but at the more general societal level, when the development process and when the source of a work is completely transparent and auditable, I no longer have to take you at your word when you make me promises about the potential offers that your project will give me or about the protections that it's going to provide me. Show of hands, who here has seen the ad of like, that's privacy, that's iPhone, for example? Plenty of us, right? We can't prove that. We kind of have to take Apple at their word, and yes, they're a reputable company for what that means, but it is kind of all behind a bunch of smoke and mirrors, right? And there's a lot of instances where it's private, but then you find out that they, had to provide 40,000 iCloud accounts because of some subpoena, and then you have to question, okay, private from other people around me, sure, but do I know it's private from you? When it becomes auditable, when you introduce transparency into the development, you don't have to worry about that because if you're worried about what it's doing, you have the ability to take a look for yourself. Or if you feel that you personally don't have that capacity, you know that other people in the community do and that they will do it. Because you're already fostering that sort of base understanding and assumption that the user has the agency to do that if they want to. And that inspires a lot of motivation to follow through with that. And when we talk about the freedom to modify and redistribute, that's equally as important. Importantly, especially in that sort of development framework, I'm sure a lot of us have had ideas for like a project that we want to do, and we stare at an empty code editor and we're like, I don't even know how to start this thing. And I call it the blank page problem because I feel like it exists a lot in writing, that you'll have this, I feel like you can sort of see this in movies or from friends, and it's like, I want to write this story, this blog, this article, and I'm staring at this empty document, I don't know how to start. Having something to build off of that you can just modify and then share around resolves that problem by giving you a base. And then upon that base, you can figure out your skills, figure out what it is that you'd like to do, and then return to that empty project going, hey, wait, the way that I did that over there actually sounds like a really good way to start. And so let's try to do that for a moment. Furthermore, when you're able to modify something and share it around the way you did it, it gives you so much agency in being able to express your own thoughts and opinions and values as far as the way technology ought to exist and ought to work, which is something that you don't get from any other product or any other development paradigm, right? And finally, especially in the case of projects that get axed because they're just not making any money, if something that's open source dies out because maybe the developer had to stop working on it or they had other changes that changed priorities in their lives, you get the opportunity to breathe new life into those projects. There are so many products and services made by Google or Microsoft that got axed just because they weren't bringing enough revenue. And that means that those projects don't exist anymore. If you were depending on them, tough luck. Find something else and find it quick because we're not going to support it for very much longer. But if something like that happened to something that already had all the transparency available and was already fostering a community of passionate developers, even if the primary lead says, hey, I can't really do this anymore, 5 other people are already putting their name in the hat, right? And saying, okay, if you can't do it, I might be able to help out. And it gives so much assured longevity beyond just that first developer. And finally, and this is an important one to us, especially when we're talking about open source, the freedom to contribute back to the original one is important. The idea that you can have your voice heard. You're able to practice the agency that you have to change things and become a part of a community of people that want to improve the software that we're all using. And again, I say the word software, but it is a stand-in. This can apply to anything. There's a lot of open source learning curriculums online that take this similar contributory approach, and they're really effective because of it. Secondly, it means that the barrier to be able to contribute drops significantly. There are so many ways that non-technologists can contribute to the open source community, and we're going to get into some of that later. I think Robert's going to talk about that in some of his slides, about how if you're a designer or if you are good at communicating information, like if you're a good science communicator, there's so much work that you can do to improve the community around and in open source. And finally, especially for the technologists in the room, it is a great way to get direct feedback from the people developing software you know is effective in what it's doing. It's one thing to sort of have a problem with an app that you're using and throw in a question into the Microsoft support forums and wait 2 months, and then somebody that also doesn't work at Microsoft is like, have you tried plugging it out, plugging it back in? And it doesn't really get you to where you want to be. But there are instances where you'll be working with something open source. Hey, this thing isn't working. You're sort of figuring out with somebody, and then you find out, oh, that was the lead developer. No wonder they were so good at it, because they're invested in everyone learning how to use their software as well. So when we're talking about open source, what we really want to get across is that it's not a specific solution to a problem. It's not a strategy or a business model. It's not that discrete. It is a framework of creation that puts transparency and democracy at the top of the priorities list in a world where we feel that isn't really happening. There are other priorities, and sometimes they get in the way of user agency and the feeling that we can use the tech the way that we want to. And so it's important for us to recognize that there is an alternative paradigm, and that it's in our interest to explore it. Talking a little bit about that framework as well, I'm of the opinion, I think us at Exec are as well, that that sort of openness is probably why, to an extent, we're all able to be here today. And when I say all, I mean the technologists in the room. If we think about programming languages that we've learned in the process of getting to where we are, Python and Java, these are open source languages developed by nonprofit foundations or referenced in open standards. The transparency has been there from day one, and it's why it's so easy to get in when you don't have to purchase a license to use something or get a subscription or fill out some other thing. You can just get it and go. And even at the higher level, when it comes to industry standard tools like Spring Boot for back-end web development or React for front-end, these tools are open source too. It's why it's why if you wanted to create your own website or web app, it's as simple as finding a little tutorial, and the first thing they say is, hey, just download this and run it. Because there's no extra intermediary step between you and getting to use the project that's going to make you, that's going to allow you to make a significant project that you think is relevant and that you think you can make, right? And so when we're talking about this framework, the reason that it's existed for so long is because it's important to recognize it started as a movement. It wasn't just some guy going like, hey, it'd actually be a really smart business idea if this was made transparent. It was a group of people who wanted to put the power of choice back in the hands of people, not in the hands of exclusive corporations that were the ones making all of the decisions regarding how tech was developed. And that sort of user agency is why we're still here today, because there's still work left to be done. And we think that it's important to consider that and how it applies to your life individually as well. And when we expand out to non-technologists, we observe that that accessibility still exists. I mean, consider Wikipedia. Just this month, the UN recognized it as a digital public good for the amount that it's been able to democratize information. I feel like years ago, or decades ago, if you wanted to find out something new about some certain project, you'd have to find a library, or find some encyclopedia, or pay for a scholarly article. The barriers to entry for just information and knowledge were high, and now it's become really democratized. This is a common tool. And even if your high school teacher told you it's not reputable, at the very least, it provides you a bountiful resource to continue finding other pieces of information, be it in references and conversations around it. So in the non-technologist side, we recognize and we've observed how openness can significantly lower barriers to entry, even in a non-technical way. And in the creative pursuits, programs like Blender have made it so easy for creatives to get their foot in the door when it comes to creation. We have tutorials that are just rife with so many views and so much support, because the entrance into being able to use the software they're talking about doesn't require that you get an Autodesk subscription. You just download it and you're ready to go. And this accessibility has proven effortful, it's proven effective, to the extent that this free and open source program, funded exclusively by user donations, was the driving force in this year's winner for Best Animated Feature at the Golden Globes. For years and years and decades, if you wanted to get this kind of international recognition, you had to have a studio. You had to have hundreds of employees. You had to have in-house solutions and out-house solutions and all this other outsourcing, and that's changing. It's becoming more accessible. It's becoming easier for the individual to feel like they have a voice in the digital world, and it's thanks to paradigms like the one that we see in open source. And even if these two specific, I'm sure that we've all used Wikipedia, but I'm sure that maybe some of us haven't necessarily used Blender. The reality is open source is so existent in the entire digital fold that it's very likely, I would even say certified, that you are either using or benefiting from open source today, even if you don't realize it. There are hundreds, and I mean hundreds, of open source projects that exist. Be they user-facing, like Blender, like the Godot game engine, the Creative Digital Art program, or lower level, libraries that support the websites and apps that we all use like to this day. There's one library called FFmpeg that pretty much does everything video related across the internet. And it's made by volunteers, funded by users, and funded by government grants. Again, this accessibility has been part of the digital fabric for as long as we can remember, but again, the awareness isn't there yet. And that's, again, why we're here. I mean, offhand, did anyone here know that Canvas was fully open source? That you can go online and look up Canvas source code. First thing to come was a GitHub repo? Yeah. And that sounds interesting as like a fun little fact, but think about what that implies. Say that I wanted to start I'm Latino, so say that I wanted to start a Spanish school for people online to learn Spanish. I don't have to feel like I have to start from scratch in developing that infrastructure because the tools as a teacher or as an educator exist right there for me to use and for me to make use of. Again, it's about the accessibility that this paradigm provides, the freedom that it gives to the individual, and how that freedom perpetuates out to the community. So, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Lance for a moment, and he's going to talk a little bit about how open source as a paradigm can apply to the development process. I'm going to walk in front of the presentation.
Yeah.
Ready? I'll not.
All right. So, I'm sure a lot of you guys here are computer science or ECE or CIS majors or just in the technology sphere. And so, not only is open source just like a paradigm of thought, I'm going to try and bring it a little bit more tangibly to the kind of outcomes it can give you as a technologist. So one big thing is making code contributions. I'm sure some of you have done this before. Maybe you've gone to an open source project on GitHub and opened a pull request or opened an issue. These are processes in open source software that allow you to get directly involved with a piece of software that you care about. If that means, I can go online and clone a repository because I found a bug, I can make those changes, send them up, and those can then be shipped in the next release. I think that's really important. And not only does it allow you to be able to develop on software, learn new things, new programming languages, new paradigms, new tech stacks, it also allows you to really learn what the development process is like outside of maybe something conventional like an internship. And what's really neat, in my opinion, about open source and what I found to be really helpful is that it's truly a merit-based experience. One thing that I feel like can be a misnomer sometimes when it comes to, just mass applying to like internships or praying for research opportunities is that all you have to do to get involved in open source is have the willingness to learn, develop software, and put yourself out there, because you don't have to apply, you don't have to send a resume, you just have to write code. And I think that that's really, really important as a developer to be like, no matter what other things are going on in my life, I have this option, I have this opportunity, I can build up my skill set, I can build up my repertoire outside of school. And I think one of our big tips for how do I really get started on this, right, is finding and focusing on projects that you personally enjoy using. I guarantee you there are pieces of software that you use right now that are open source, or libraries that you use. As if you're into web development, a heavy part of tech stacks that you use these days are open source. And so there's ways for you to give back and improve on the technology that you use as a developer that you're interested in. And that also really helps with building up motivation and longevity in you caring, because there's a positive feedback loop of you giving to the things that give to you, right? I think the other big one is meeting a community of like-minded developers and getting mentorship. I've personally had the experience of contributing to a couple of different open source projects, and I've been able to communicate directly with these lead developers, and they've been able to give me feedback, offer me connections when it comes to different work opportunities. And the thing is, open source contributors really care about each other. It's a community. We want to build each other up, because if you're a better developer, we have better outcomes. And I think that that's a really big part of the open source mindset. And then another piece of advice that we often give is focusing on practical solutions to experience. Is that what it says?
Yes.
Yes, experience. Sorry, Marcel.
You're good.
But yeah, one thing that I think can be a little frightening about open source at first, or working on personal projects, is feeling that imposter syndrome, or that I feel like I can't meaningfully contribute to this thing that I care about. Sometimes the best thing you can do is get in discussion forums, or some use IRC chats, Discord servers, or Matrix group conversations. Just start talking to these developers. Say, look, I'm not familiar with, X piece of software, but I really care about your tooling. What's like a good place for me to get started? And you'd be shocked how much they're willing to get you started on practical things so that you can feel like you're able to contribute, you're able to care, and I think that that's really important. Our former president of the Open Source Club, Adrian Bo, we love him. He had a very positive experience working on open source in college. So in his third year at university, he started developing his own Linux distribution. And while working through that process, he discovered that certain features from a Linux subprocess called systemd didn't exist. And he started contributing to this and adding the features that he needed to build up his operating system. And then those contributions led to recognition and then invitations to different open source conferences, getting him involved in conversations with people in the wider open source community. And now, outside of college, he has been contracted to work with the GNOME Foundation, who are an open source nonprofit, to continue the work that he started in his personal operating system officially under their brand. And he's trying to bring that mission to a wider audience due to GNOME's reach. I think that's really impressive and an important story that is wholly plausible for anyone here. And then creating your own open source projects is kind of the other side. So outside of contributions, there's actually a lot of benefits to open sourcing your own work that you do. I'm sure you've probably had to do projects for different classes, or you've been interested in making your own piece of software for fun, or just for learning reasons. And open sourcing those software that you write actually can have really positive benefits for you as a technologist. And so for those who already have ideas or projects on the way, open source them. I highly recommend looking at the Open Source Initiative's website and reviewing some licenses and seeing how you want to be able to share your code online. Because making your code public has a lot of benefits to you when it comes to like seeking for career opportunities. And so, and for those who don't have projects currently, we recommend that starting with contributions. It can really get you inspired to try and build things of your own. You might find that you want to fork an existing project and add your own features that kind of go in a new direction. And then also, when you have your own projects, you can build up that inspiration, feedback, and potentially lead to other developers, wanting to build off of your work. And that's kind of a big part of the open source community in terms of that inspiration and sharing of ideas and that open marketplace of thought that's more concerned about the creation of something useful and good for as many people as possible, rather than trying to keep your ideas really secretive and to yourself, because you might be potentially worried about different outcomes with that. But kind of as a more sorry. This also allows you to create an auditable and reviewable portfolio, which is what I want to talk about next. So the reason why that's really, really, really important is because, say I'm a company, and you apply and you put some GitHub links in a project section on your resume, or maybe you link to a personal website, which then has your projects on it, and then I can look at the source code for those. Having an auditable and reviewable portfolio allows companies to, say, who is Lance as a developer? What kind of stuff does he work on? He's applying to do, let's say, I personally applied to do firmware work. They're like, is Lance experienced in C programming? Does he understand real-time operating systems? Well, they were able to look at my GitHub profile and see that I've been working on a Linux shell since September. And they were able to really get involved in my code, and that got me an interview, and they asked me direct and targeted questions about the code that I wrote. And that's because it was open source. If I had kept that code closed, they have to take me at my word, right? But when you put it out in the open, not only do you have the potential to kind of inspire and get contributions back, but you also can benefit yourself when putting your own work out there. So I did that, and also I've built up a bit of a community. So an old game engine from 1996 called the Quake engine has a really strong and tight-knit community around it, but their tooling is very ancient, considering that it came out in the 90s. So I decided over the summer to write a brand new game engine editor for it, and I've been able to meet tons of new people, make great connections, and I think that that's kind of the biggest thing I want to hone in on when it comes to open source as a developer, is it's not even as much about the technology that you learn or the opportunities that brings, it's the people you meet. In this world, it can feel kind of impersonal when you're applying for jobs or trying to build up who you are as a technologist. But open source allows you to build community and get those really good networking skills, which can be quite challenging to get into in today's day and age. And then I think we've got Robert here talking about open source.
Hey, Robert.
So, wait, do I just click the...
Yeah, just the down arrow.
Okay. So one important question, which I think is really critical when interacting with software, is really thinking critically about, for each piece of software you're using, the impact it is having on your life. Sorry about that. So this is something which I need to personally think about a lot more, and I think a lot of people do as well, in the sense that when we are going about our lives, whatever it is we're doing, technology is always involved. It's always there in the background. Whether I'm writing an essay for one of my classes on Google Docs or Microsoft Word, or whether I'm trying to hang out with some friends and I'm messaging them over Discord or SMS or WhatsApp or anything else. Technology is always there, and it's important to think about why did you start using this specific piece of software in the first place? What are the benefits it is giving to your life, and what are the potential costs it's giving to your life as well? And do those which side outweighs the other? This is something that a lot of people often think about when it comes to social media, in the sense that while social media can be very helpful for connecting with other people, the algorithms that are in place oftentimes can hurt that as well, and can hurt your mental health as you just keep scrolling and keep scrolling and keep scrolling. Sorry. It's also important to think about, for other pieces of software as well, the specific practices being done by the company. Do you agree with everything that's being done? Oftentimes you might hear about various privacy violations being committed by the company, or how they may not be adequately compensating their workers. And oftentimes you can feel sort of helpless in that you need to use this technology throughout your life, but it's being made by companies who you don't always necessarily agree with. So it can oftentimes feel like you don't have any other option. But you do. There's so many options. Pretty much any piece of software you're using, I can almost 100% say there is a open source alternative, whatever that might be. Instead of using Chrome, you could use Firefox. Instead of using Photoshop, you could use Krita. Windows, you could use Linux, so on and so forth. It should always be noted, of course, that this isn't exactly a black and white issue. Just because you're using open source software for one thing doesn't mean you need to always be using open source software for absolutely everything. For example, we actually made this slides presentation in Google Slides, which is proprietary, it's not open source. But that's just because it met the requirements we needed for this. Open source is all about finding the software you need to make your life better. If the open source alternative doesn't have the features you need, then it's better to just use the proprietary version. For us, while they're all great open source alternatives to Google Slides, none of them had the same features to easily collaborate with one another that we needed. So for this particular instance, we chose to use Google Slides instead. And it's also really good to learn, rather than just having tech be in the background always, bringing it to the forefront a little bit more. Just like with anything else, maybe you enjoy reading, and you enjoy reading with friends, or going to clubs about reading. Or if you enjoy watching movies, and you enjoy watching movies with friends even more, you can do the same thing with tech. Perhaps you enjoy a specific piece of software, you can find other people who also care about that software, and you can form a community around that, sort of like what Lance was saying earlier. There's so many ways to get involved with any given piece of software, and to contribute to it as well. Regardless of what your specific skill set is, there is always a way to contribute. It might be as simple as you're using a piece of software and you run into a bug. So you open up a bug on an issue on GitHub and you explain what happened so that other people can work on fixing it. Or you might be bilingual. You might know other languages, so you can contribute translations to a project. This is particularly important just to be able to provide more accessibility to software, so it can be used all across the world by people no matter what language they speak. But it's something that we often don't really think about as much, even though it's so easy to do. Or it could be sharing customizations. Perhaps you're using a piece of software and you themed it to just look a little prettier. Maybe other people would like that as well. So sharing that, helping build a community in that sense. Or it might be making and improving the documentation. It's happened to me a couple of times where I was using a piece of software and I was trying to work out how to do something specific, but I'm reading online and there's just no information about how to do it. Eventually, like after a couple hours, you find a specific blog post where it vaguely says what you're supposed to do. But like going through and just writing how to do things, even if it's on a forums or if it's on official documentation, helps out users so much. And of course, we also, when talking about contribution, need to talk about fundraising efforts. When you have proprietary software, it can oftentimes the funding comes from the company itself. Google Slides, made by Google, funded by Google, from mostly their ad revenue and so on and so forth. But with open source software, it can be a little more difficult, and oftentimes open source software relies on user donations in order to keep going. So one thing good to think about is the amount of money you're already spending on various pieces of software, whether that be Netflix, Disney Plus, or other options as well. Maybe you're paying for the Adobe Suite. If you're already willing and capable, of course, to pay for the software you're using, it can also be good to think about paying for software even if you don't necessarily need to pay. Supporting the software that you love goes a long way to helping the developers continue doing what they're doing. Even if they're doing it out of passion, everyone needs to eat, and food costs money. So they need to get money somehow. And if they're spending a lot of time making software you use and you appreciate that, it can go a long way to help them out a little bit. So even though I'm not a developer, I don't know how to code, I'm a history major, I have also been able to get involved in open source communities. There's a specific fork or a modification of Firefox called Zen Browser. It's currently in a fairly early beta. Things are breaking quite often. But I use it all the time. I really enjoy what it's doing. It's really focused on customization, which is something I spend far too much time doing. I just gradually got more and more involved, just joined Discord, started talking with people, and long story short, I somehow ended up becoming the Discord admin, running one of the official servers specifically for customizing Zen Browser. And I don't really know how this happened because I can't write code, but I'm here. So even if you aren't contributing in the very direct sense of writing code, there's so much you can do. Like Marcial especially spoke about earlier, there can be the sense of helplessness when you're using proprietary software and it just isn't doing what you want to do, but it's really just nothing much you can do. Sure, you can go on the Microsoft forums and ask them to fix it, but they're never going to. And even if you know you could fix it if you wanted to, you just can't, because the source code isn't available to you. But having access to that source code, being able to get involved more directly, being able to talk directly to the people who are making the software you use, allows you to create this community, and it removes that isolation. suddenly it's no longer you screaming into the void of the Microsoft forums. It's you directly speaking to the developers who are making the software you use and giving them your ideas directly. And I'm going to hand it over to Lizzie to talk about...
Hey. So I feel like it's pretty safe to say that everybody in this room is either part of a movement or an organization working towards a cause with a common goal. And so a really good example of that is ACM-W, with one of their missions is supporting, celebrating, and advocating for women in computing. Yay! Shout out to ACM-W! So it's really common, I'd almost say it's like natural for organizations, communities, all that stuff, to use different platforms like Instagram or GroupMe or Microsoft Office or Microsoft Teams to help build that community, to help communicate with each other. They're just like industry standard tools. But something that's worth noting is that every single example here is proprietary. They all are owned by a parent company. And all of these specific examples are actually publicly traded companies. So why does that matter? Well, so because they're all publicly traded companies, their number one priority is, maximizing stock values. Yay, stocks! Nice sandpaper. So while a lot of these brands, especially Instagram, Facebook, they brand themselves upon being community driven, they aren't. It's a pretty common misconception. And so what that results in is discrepancies between the users of the platform and the people who actually control what can be said on that platform. So an example, algorithms. Take, for example, like the Instagram algorithm or just like any recommendation algorithm. Because their priority is profits, they're going to maximize user engagement. And that sometimes comes at the cost of the actual quality or truth of the information that is being recommended. So that leads to stuff like rage bait or even just straight up censorship. There you go. But there are alternatives. So there is an open source alternative to social media that's pretty popular. It's called Mastodon. If anybody here with a background in open source has heard of the Fediverse, it's integrated with the Fediverse. Yeah, if you have any questions about that, reach out to us. It's really, really cool, but that's like a whole other can of worms. But pretty obviously, a big obstacle to actually, actual functionality of that as a community platform is the user base. There's sort of like this feedback loop where even though we might be aware of the flaws within Instagram, everybody has an Instagram because everybody else has an Instagram. Everybody else is on Instagram. Like, why would I use anything else? Why would I use Mastodon? I don't know anybody who has a Mastodon account. But that's a huge part of that is because we aren't aware of alternatives. Most people aren't aware of alternatives. And also people aren't aware of the benefits. A lot of people aren't aware of how recommendation algorithms actually work. Or if they do, they don't understand the how drastic that impact is. Or how to actually make that transition. It's a sort of thing where the transition isn't going to happen overnight, but as more and more people become aware of the fact that there are alternatives, we hope to see some positive changes with that. And that is a huge part of why we function as a club and why we decide to go out and reach out to people, is because we hope that by spreading awareness, we can just hopefully sort of make baby steps towards that transition in the culture around social media and proprietary software and open source and just awareness. Just because it isn't easy doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing it. I don't know. All right, that's my spiel.
Yeah. And that's exactly right. That's one of the biggest reasons that we want to reach out to other clubs and do these collabs, is because the biggest barrier to entry for a lot of these things is just the fact that it's not out in the open. When you consider the companies that run a lot of these proprietary softwares, think of how much money they have in marketing. The billboards and the ads that you see, they're trying to put themselves in your attention every moment they can, right? It's like the whole Coca-Cola quote that they spend so-and-so amount of money on marketing, and half of it works and half of it doesn't. They don't know which half to get rid of. But either way, that figures in the millions. And it's the reason that people sometimes say Coke when they mean soda, because the more that these proprietary softwares, especially specifically, can integrate themselves as normal in your lives, the less you'll think about the alternatives that might exist that focus more on the communities. Now this all sounds well and good, and we can all sit around, talk about how great it would be if in a world where people prioritize openness and prioritize transparency and democracy in tech, but how feasible is it really to begin integrating these open paradigms into your development work, into the way you personally use digital tools, and into the way that digital tools integrate themselves in your communities, right? I mean, that feels like something really, really drastic. Well, the truth is, I've been doing it this whole time. For the last 2 years, I have used almost exclusively open source software to manage a lot of the communication between friends, to manage the way that I do my academic work, to manage the way that I do my professional work. Robert and Lance as well. We've been using open source software for so long, and if you were interfacing with us or watching us work, you'd never even be able to tell. Because the truth is that they've come a long way. The barriers to entry have never been lower, and they keep getting better, because at the end of the day, the people who are working on these projects are putting us at the forefront. They want them to be better for the community that they're fostering, not because they want to see some imaginary number go up. They want things to be better because they know that at the end of the day, it's about the people using it. And it's really important to recognize, it's exactly what Lizzie was saying about this whole positive or negative feedback loop when it comes to social media, that you just keep using because everyone else is using it. It would be so hard to migrate. But if you're able to be willing to just stop for a moment and take a breath and think critically about, okay, what does this tool do for me? Why do I use it? What other things could be accomplishing that goal? You'll find more often than not that sometimes you don't have to have the dependence you currently have on the tech that you use. And maybe it's something small, right? Maybe it's like, okay, I miss my ad blocker, so I'll switch to Firefox instead of Chrome. But every other time you stop and think, you'll find there's one more thing you can change. And one more thing you can change. And slowly you gain more control over the way that you use your tech. And you'll find that there's less stress around using social media, there's less stress around just being on the internet, because you're not bombarded with all these things that are meant to rip your attention out from your grasp and put it into a machine that will turn it into a consumer, right? And that's huge. And it means that, like, for me personally, to give a little small anecdote, I don't have social media. I don't. And I'm still able to maintain a lot of the relationships that I have because it's not super necessary. Years and years of being on it can make you think it is, but if you stop and think, sometimes it doesn't have to be, right? And so I just wanted to share that a little bit. And now that we're sort of at the end here, I'm going to go ahead and quickly wrap up what we've talked about, sort of hit the home points, right? The biggest thing is that we hope the biggest thing is that you might be able to reflect on how open source has influenced your life as a technologist thus far. Maybe from this you don't necessarily go off and start looking into all the alternatives that exist, but at least hold reverence for the people that got us to where we are today. Being able to sit here and enjoy a lot of these technologies that are making us better developers, better members of the industry, because they wanted to focus on the accessibility of the tech first and foremost. And beyond that as well, it'd be great if you could consider how you might be able to integrate open source into your development pipelines, into how you might be able to leverage that community and the community you might build to sharpen your skills, develop your skills, and show those skills to the other people that might be interested in your work. If you want to go ahead and take it that extra step further, exploring the other alternatives that exist to the proprietary solutions we use today. Like Robert was saying, those 4 examples, the first 4 that I picked out of a hat, but there are so many options, whether you're a creative, whether you're somebody who's more into the tech stuff, whether it's some combination or something entirely different. There's always a community of people who are just like you, who at some point said, I want the tools to be able to complete this and to accomplish this to be in the hands of people. I want to eliminate some of those barriers because I know how much good can come of that. And if you want to take it all the way to the end, consider how the movements that you're a part of depend on tools that you have no control over. The risk that's involved with that, be it in general, especially with social media silencing and censorship, or even more beyond that in just the logistical sense, what if the tool that you're using stops being profitable for the company? You're not going to have that for very much longer. And do you want to migrate when it's the last moment, or do you want to start looking at things today and assuring that longevity in a way that doesn't necessarily have you scrambling at the last minute? But the most important thing that we hope we have been able to express at the development level, at the personal level, and even at the community level is that if you're willing to let it be, open source can prove an indispensable role in the way that you interface with technology and the way that technology becomes a part of your life. And that's all I had. So thank you so much for coming by.